Hello and welcome to Senior Focus. My name is Laurie, and with me today we have Suzanne Otte from the BU School of Social Work Hoarding Research Team. Welcome, Suzanne.
Hi, Laurie. It's great to be here.
So many things I want to talk about today, but I think the good place to start is, can you help us understand what is hoarding?
Absolutely. Hoarding is really defined by 3 points, if we think about it. It's the acquisition or failure to discard a large number of possessions that may be useless, appear useless to us or of limited value to us, but not to the person who has the hoarding problem. Second is that living spaces are really cluttered. They're sufficiently cluttered so that it really precludes the purpose of the space that it was originally intended for. And then third is that there's significant distress or impairment because of the hoarding in functioning to the person because there's a hoarding problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
So is there somebody in particular that tends to hoard? Are you seeing in your research that it's a particular demographic?
Absolutely. So hoarding tends to start in childhood around the age of 13, interestingly, we found in research. But that people don't really tend to seek assistance with the problem until middle age, until about age 50. So most who come to us happen to be female and happen to be around the age of 50. Their marital status, they tend to be single. There's a high rate of divorce. People tend to live alone who have the problem. The education levels of folks with a hoarding problem vary widely. They can be from very educated and accomplished professionals to people who don't have as much education. The family history of the person tends to be telling of if there will be a hoarding problem in the future. People who hoard tend to have parents and siblings also who perhaps had a problem. Conditions of squalor, so many times people think about hoarding equates to a very dirty home. That doesn't tend to be as common for people who seek help. So squalor can equal having animal waste or human waste, rotting food in the home. The home can be in decay because of the hoarding that's happened. There can also be serious odors and damage that happens because of the problem. It's estimated between 9 and 15 million people in the U.S. have some form of hoarding, so about 3 to 5% of the population, which is quite significant. And there's a global prevalence of the problem. So it's not only in the U.S. that this is happening. We've seen data from Asia. We've seen data from Europe as well that would indicate that it's quite widespread.
Wow. Huh. So what are some of the features of hoarding? How do we know, and how do we know what's hoarding versus somebody that just has some clutter?
Has a problem with clutter, right? Well, above all, it's a mental health disorder. And the clutter is really just a symptom of the problem. If you visualize an iceberg, for example, and you think about what you see above the water, it's that chip of ice. If that represented the clutter, what lies below the water would represent the mental health issues that accompany hoarding. So it is quite a mental health disorder, and people tend to discount that at times when they think about the problem. It's really characterized by low levels of insight. So people who hoard will not think that this is a great problem, whereas people who come into the home or who live in the community around the person may deem it quite significant and problematic. There are social and functioning problems that go along with this. There tends to be social isolation, strain in relationships between parents and loved ones, as well as landlords and neighbors.
Right.
There can be legal and financial problems as well. There tends to be problems with credit card debt, declining home values, property damage. People can incur high expenses because they have to store their items off-site sometimes, away from home, because they run out of space. So they can be paying thousands of dollars a month in storage values, or in storage costs rather, to store their items. It's estimated between 8 and 12% of people who hoard have either been evicted or have been threatened with an eviction.
Wow.
So quite problematic. And about 54% of people who hoard have problems paying their bills, as opposed to 38% of the general population. So it shows that there is definitely financial burden to hoarding. Folks are about 3 times as likely to be overweight or obese versus family members. And there are work problems that come from this. There's an average of about 6 days per month at what we call work impairment days. So either days missed away from the office or away from work because of hoarding, or just interruptions in the workday. So it creates a problem in terms of generating income when you can't be at work consistently.
Right.
There's also some gender issues with this. So females tend to have more difficulty starting and finishing tasks. They're also, they tend to have more comorbid symptoms, so more major depression, more phobias, PTSD, whereas men tend to present with more generalized anxiety. And we see more women in treatment. Women just tend to treat themselves for the problem more often than men do seek treatment. But I had seen some statistics that said that men tend to be more hoarders than women. So it's interesting.
That is interesting.
In terms of the pattern of how people seek treatment.
Right.
Absolutely. Hoarding evolves. So there's a process and how it evolves. There's really little evidence to show that people growing up who had little in the way of materials or belongings will later become hoarders. A lot of people think, oh, I grew up with nothing and now I can have all these things and therefore I'm more at risk. That's not true, we found.
That's interesting.
Hoarding is actually, or typically precipitated by a loss. So if there was a death in the family, some sort of trauma that can trigger hoarding. It can be chronic or worsening in course, so it can start as rather insignificant and grow over the years. And insight into the problem can fluctuate, so people can think, oh, this is a problem I want to work on, and then tend not to believe it to be that true later on. So it's definitely broad in scope.
Right. So what are some of the vulnerabilities of the hoarding, for the hoarder?
Sure. So there's been some research that has shown that there are, in some hoarders, frontal brain abnormalities, and this can affect problems with cognitive processing. So problems with sustaining attention or memory, or impulse control or decision making, all things that we take for granted when we don't have that sort of physiological issue. Those who do, it can impede them. The values and behaviors of one's parents, so what you grew up with, what was modeled to you, can impact people who hoard as well. The health and the time constraints of the person or the mood, if they're generally negative, doesn't make it as likely for them to want to work on the problem. And comorbid mental or physical conditions. So about 92% of people who hoard have one or more mental health problems.
Wow.
And we see that major depression is more prevalent across the board with people who hoard. But they can also present with social phobias, generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, and panic. So the range can be quite broad.
So what are some of the common misconceptions that you're finding? What is it that people are misunderstanding about hoarding?
Well, the biggest is that hoarding is not a moral issue. It's a mental health disorder. It's a mental health problem. It's not about laziness or lack of standards. It's not about this lack of responsibility on behalf of the person who's doing the hoarding. And it's interesting that many people's opinions about hoarding are influenced by pop culture. We've seen shows like Hoarding Buried Alive or Hoarders really make some headway in terms of their viewership. So I believe Hoarding has been on the air for about 6 years.
Wow.
And in 2012, they had about 2.4 million viewers. And that was a 60% rate of growth from the previous year in viewership. So they have a lot more people watching the show and really forming opinions about what hoarding is about. And the shows don't always show the full picture. They don't always show the clinical intervention that can be beneficial to the problem.
So people that are hoarding, what are some of the other behaviors that a loved one might note? What are some of the other things that might show up at the same time?
Sure. Well, there's often personality interferences that happen. So interestingly, people can have really high standards in terms of perfectionism or attention to detail at the cost of the big picture. So seeing the big picture of my house is really quite messy, but this little tiny thing looks so lovely. They're focused on the little tiny thing, not so much on the overall living space and the condition of it. Tends to be some indecisiveness going on, some difficulty regulating emotions, so people can be easily upset and very hard to calm down, and just a general difficulty taking other people's perspective. So seeing it through other people's eyes is difficult for folks.
So as you know, the show is senior focused, so we want to know specifically what can we do when either for our seniors that might be noting it in themselves or for a loved one, what are some of the specific considerations we need to keep in mind when helping a senior that might have a hoarding issue?
There are some considerations to take into account when you're working with someone who may have a hoarding problem, who is a senior. There are conditions that affect safety, such as fire hazards, sanitation issues. There may be blocked doors and windows in the home, obstructed pathways throughout the home, structural damage to the dwelling, which may make it dangerous for the person to live there, as well as frayed wiring or exposed wiring that can again create a fire hazard. There are conditions that affect one's health, so the presence of insects or rodents can be dangerous. Human or animal waste, not as common, but it's still dangerous. Mold, mildew, fungus, any self-neglect signs are things to watch for. It's helpful to know which elder protective services agencies are around you and what kinds of laws and regulations they're held to, they're upholding. So that you can make sure that your senior is in compliance with those. Addressing any neglect issues or abuse issues certainly is paramount to approaching someone about a hoarding problem. And senior centers, and there's special community centers in town and around towns that can assist with intervention and with assessment of a hoarding problem as well.
Do you have any advice or suggestions for people that are noting hoarding in a loved one, some advice and some challenges that they might be facing?
Sure. Well, there's some strategies actually that you can take when you're attempting to assist someone with the problem. And one is to really focus on building a personal relationship. So that's a critical factor to the work, building that trust and that bond. Focusing on self-efficacy and self-determination for the senior, and reminding them that hoarding can really interfere with those goals, and so that can serve to boost motivation if the eye on the prize is toward being more self-sufficient and living without clutter. That can motivate. Communicating sensitivity about the meaning of items. So as you go through life, you tend to collect more things that are sentimental and of value, and really presenting a respectful approach to that is helpful to the process. Most seniors, as most people, don't like to be termed hoarders, so really watching your language and making sure that you're not labeling or using negative words when you talk about hoarding. Keeping the senior focused on the task at hand. So when you're doing the work, it's hard. It's easy to get distracted. It's tiring, and it can be emotionally draining for both parties. So making sure that the focus is where it should be, and limiting the time that you work on the problem as well to the tolerance of the senior and to you. Facilitating decision making, so helping the senior make their own decision, asking them questions that will help them arrive at their answers, not making the decision for them, not telling them how they should feel is important.
Sure.
Being a cheerleader, bringing a positive attitude to something that can be sort of a drag, but trying to make it as pleasant of an experience as it can be, and being an ally in that way is important. Helping with practical issues, so after you do the work in the home, you'll likely have some things that need to be removed and either donated or sent to the landfill, and so removing those from the home as opposed to leaving them there where they can be reabsorbed into the senior's belongings is helpful. It's important not to touch things without permission from the senior, because they hold their belongings so near and dear to their heart. Just important to remember that there should be some respect for their belongings. And then, again, not working beyond your tolerance level, knowing what your limits are, not getting it all done in one day, but rather spacing it out over a period of time can be more progress for the effort.
So if someone suspects hoarding, what would their next steps be?
Sure. So there's an approach that we recommend. It's called the harm reduction approach. And it's outlined in one of the books that I recommend as a resource called Digging Out. But the harm reduction approach is really an alternative approach for seniors who don't respond well to traditional treatment methods. It helps really to mitigate risk to the seniors and communities that they live in. And it decreases the risk of alienation. It really emphasizes safe, comfortable living in a happy comfortable home as opposed to living with fewer possessions and limiting what someone can have in their home. And it's a more pragmatic alternative for families and caregivers to follow. The elements of the approach are to do no harm, and the goal is really to make positive life changes even if the hoarding overall doesn't cease. It may not come to a complete stop, but if there's ways that you can slow it down and to help the senior be more mindful of it,
Sure.
that is progress. The senior is an essential part of the team, and change is going to be slow through the process. Setbacks don't indicate failure. Motivation will wax and wane, but sticking with it and being committed partners in the process is very helpful. And again, keeping in mind that the senior may have other more immediate challenges to address, such as health and safety concerns
Sure.
that should come first before working on decluttering a home.
So what are some of the resources that are available to people that want to learn more about hoarding or have a concern that they or somebody they love might have hoarding as an issue?
Sure. So there are a couple of websites that I recommend. One is the International OCD Foundation Hoarding Center, and that's at www.ocfoundation.org/hoarding. There's a second website maintained by Mass Housing, and that's www.masshousing.com/hoarding. And there you'll find a number of articles, research studies, sources for referrals if people want to get some clinical assistance around a hoarding issue. There are an abundance of books as well, and several of them have been written by my research cohorts from Boston University and their colleagues. And one that I spoke of earlier in our conversation and I recommend is Digging Out. It's helping your loved one manage clutter, hoarding, and compulsive acquiring. And that really speaks to the behaviors of hoarding and strategies to assist while doing no harm, as we talked about. And I'd like to just touch back on
Sure.
hoarding behaviors because it
great.
is an important part of recognizing when there is a problem, when people are behaving in a particular way. There are
Sure.
really three aspects to it. One is saving. There are reasons that people give to why they save their items. There's sentimental reasons, so this represents part of my life, it's part of me. Or instrumental, I can use this later, this little button I'm going to use in a craft project later. Or intrinsic, it's just beautiful and I just like to have it in my home. The second behavior is acquisition. So Home Shopping Network contributes to this. eBay, the ease of which we shop online now makes it a lot easier to bring things into our homes. Also acquiring free things, so pamphlets and flyers, even trash picking and dumpster diving, or FreeCycle, which is an online site where people can acquire things for free without paying. It's sort of a trade site that people pick things up from. Stealing and kleptomania, it tends to not be as much of a factor, although it is yet another way to acquire that people can follow. The third point is cluttering, and that leads to disorganization. So having random piles throughout one's house is symptomatic of clutter, and churning, fear of putting things out of sight. I might forget about it if it's not within eyeshot. Fear of making the wrong decision is also a big factor in those behaviors.
Sure.
So there's also challenges related to those behaviors to keep in mind. There's emotions about those possessions, as we talked about, vulnerabilities, as we talked about as well, such as past trauma and family history, the comorbid conditions, the mental health conditions that come into play that can aggravate the problem, and cognitive distortions, or what we call problematic thinking about the ways that people think about their items. And the way that we can get around this is to challenge folks with questions about their possessions. So asking them, how many of these widgets do you have? Or how many would be enough? Is there information that you can get outside of the stack of paper? Is there another way to get it, such as at the library or online? Do you need to keep 20 years of the New York Times in your house? And is keeping the item really helping or hurting your efforts to work on the problem of hoarding? Asking about advantages or disadvantages of an item. So how is it advantageous to keep this item in your home versus discarding it? Taking another perspective. So again, this can be challenging for someone to do, but asking how your landlord might feel if they walked in and saw the home in disrepair. How would you deal with that? And looking forward, and often people who have a hoarding issue don't tend to look beyond the immediate. So talking about how would you like your home to be in 6 months? Would you like to have company into your home? Because there's a lot of isolation happening. People don't tend to have company. They don't tend to invite others in. Is that something they'd like to do? Is that a goal that they could aspire to?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we've got a lot of information, and that was fantastic.
Perfect.
If you have any further questions for Suzanne, you can reach her or the Hoarding team at Boston University at Hoarding, HOARDING, at bu.edu. And certainly if you have any questions for me or show suggestions, I would love to hear from you. My number is 978-276-2010. Thank you for joining us.